We got our next fabulous guest. He is in the chat room with us on today. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Hello, can you hear me?
Huh? Yes,
Okay.
we can.
Hello, sorry about that. How are you? It's so great to be with you guys.
We are
It's
good.
so
We
great
thank you
to
for joining
have
us.
you.
Absolutely, I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. Our topic today is committing to you first. But before we get into the topic, we just wanted to talk a little bit just about your journey, Jamal. We want you to tell everybody just a little bit about your literary journey into not only just books, but film.
Well, actually, I'm not an actor, but I'm an author, and but I always tell people, and this is kind of an interesting, some people find this to be interesting, but I've never, writing does not come natural for me. It's not something I ever visualize myself doing. But writing, I've written a couple of books, and before that I was a blogger. But really, a lot of my writing work has come out of almost a deep sense of frustration. Initially, it was frustration that some of these messages that were burning inside me, I felt like wasn't being talked about. And nobody, or I won't say nobody, but largely around the country and around the world, people who were speaking on various subjects in regards to spirituality or in regards to just your purpose and your work. And it just seemed that these conversations were not happening. And I almost felt like, well, if I don't speak up, then who's going to speak up? And so this message was just burning in me. And so that's why I decided to eventually write and to communicate through the medium of writing. But it's not actually natural for me. It feels, sometimes it can feel like giving. Of course, I'm not a woman, so I don't know. But I've heard it's like giving birth. There's a sense of just it's a labor of love and that kind of thing. But it's not something I would ever envision myself doing.
Absolutely. We always talk about a go moment here, and a go moment is when thought and execution come together. A lot of times we're really mindful about how we pour into other people or even how they pour into themselves. But when we deal with ourselves, it's always in a form of lack, or we can't do something right now, or it's never the right time. And so when you decided to sit down and actually go into the lane of being a published author, what was that process like for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I would have these conversations in my head, and I would talk to other writers that would have these same conversations. And, it's always a question of credibility, right? So sometimes people say, well, who are you to write this book, or who are you to say this? And that's the question that our mind likes to, sometimes that's a narrative that kind of comes up. And I had to understand that, first of all, that's just a narrative. That's a cycle. It's a part of my own unconscious, subconscious script that was created or developed in this, with this sense of not good enough. And that really, nobody would choose to program themselves. I always say, hey, if you were in control of the subconscious scripts and narratives that we tell ourselves, we would never, design a script that says I'm not good enough or I'm not qualified. So obviously that came from somewhere else and somebody else. And largely we're not even aware of that. So for me, that came from my own family dynamics, my own generational history in which lots of people felt not good enough. And so therefore that got passed to me, and I thought that was my voice. It wasn't even my voice. So finally I had to say, who's saying this? Where's this voice coming from? And then to recognize that it's not my voice. Well, my voice began to sound very different. And my voice, one of the things that my voice began to say deep and internally was, your life qualifies you. Your experiences qualify you. So you're always qualified to talk about your experience, your life. And then the next question was, well, I'm not a writer. That's another narrative. Well, I'm not a writer. Well, then the question is like, well, when do you become a writer? And sometimes when I'm in my coaching work and I'm working with folks who want to write, they'll say, well, I'm not really a writer. I say, well, when will you become a writer? I say, well, when I get published. Like, well, how will you get published if you don't write? So because writers, and it boils down to this, writers write. Non-writers don't write. So if you can perceive yourself as a writer, then you'll write. So you're a writer. I always tell people you're a writer when you say you are, because that's what writers
right.
do. So who you are is who you perceive yourself to be. So for me, it was instrumental to sit down and to just kind of observe this narrative that was going on in my head. I'm not a writer. I'm not qualified. And say that's not even my voice. And my experience has qualified me, and I'm a writer. And in this moment, if I sit down and put my fingers to the keyboard and start sharing a message that's burning inside of me, then I'm a writer in this moment.
Absolutely. And ultimately, you're committing to yourself. You know what I'm saying?
That's true.
A lot of times, we want to commit to everything else and then never commit to ourselves until after we've lost ourselves into whatever it is that we're doing. You have these fabulous books, but you have a book, your first book, I believe, and it was, Free to Love? And it talked about marriage and singleness. You know, we were talking about that earlier in the show about how everybody is confusing casually dating with intent and purpose. I think that in anything that you do, you have to move with intent and purpose, or you're not going to go anywhere. But a lot of times we're just out here casually being ourselves, casually living life, and never really committing to who we are and what we want. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. And when it comes to relationships specifically, a lot of times when you talk about casually entering into life, or casually, whether it's dating or getting into relationships, what I have found is that the casual approach to life and relationships is really just a mirror. So I'm casually committed to myself, right? So and this is not conscious, right? But if I'm casually committed to myself, then that means I'm not actively stepping into who I am, my essence. And when that occurs, there's always a sense, and we can know we're doing this because there's a feeling of being incomplete. There's a feeling of there's something missing. And so a lot of times we take that unconsciously. It's not we're always aware of this. We take that deep sense of incompleteness or something's missing, and then we approach relationships with the expectation that this other person in some way is going to complete me, is somehow going to meet this need. But because I am looking for that other person to complete me, I cannot actually engage in that relationship in a wholehearted manner with them. So you always have one foot in and one foot out, and you're not really committed in the relationship. But it took me a long time to realize that when I could not casually step into my being, but actively look at all parts of me, the parts of me that I loved, and even the parts of me that quote unquote I would see as broken, but there was just trauma there that needed attention. When I could engage and step into my trauma, begin to move into places of healing, and really to get close to those parts of me that I didn't want to acknowledge or even to feel. When I began to be able to move into that wholeheartedly and commit to myself wholeheartedly, even commit to my purpose, my work, what I started noticing was that relationships were just a mirror. They started to mirror that commitment. And I could be fully committed in a relationship with whoever I was with. Whatever type of relationship that was, I was fully present and committed to them, and my relationships completely transformed.
Absolutely. And a lot of times, until you commit to yourself, you're kind of really just going through the motions, especially in relationships. And then that causes us to stay too long. Every relationship is not forever. Everything has an expiration date. But when we tend to kind of not commit to ourselves and our growth, we kind of put our own selves in a standstill, and we're really just walking through life. We're really not doing life. We're just there. So you're in that relationship going through the motions, but you really aren't happy. And the expectation that a lot of people have is that somebody else makes you happy. And other people can't make you happy. It's not possible. But I'm glad that you were able to come into that understanding, like, this is what I want, this is what I need for myself. And once you found that, you were able to find that I can have these relationships that I want, but I had to have me first.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I always say happiness, I had to learn this through a lot of struggle and suffering, but realize that happiness or misery is an inside job. So what I experience in life, I experience internally. And for so long, I had, outsourced that or made other people liable for my inner state of being. And that put a lot of pressure unconsciously. I didn't do this purposely, but because I made other people liable for my state of being, anytime I would get into a relationship, I put a lot of pressure on that. There was a lot of weight on that relationship because it had to be something that only I could do for myself. But I realized that when, what's beautiful about relationships, because some people will say, well, if you don't need anything from that other person, why do you want to be in a relationship? And my answer to that often is when you step into all that you are, that's not a small thing. There's actually, I look at it as it's almost like a waterfall. There's an abundance of love. There's an abundance of peace. There's an abundance of, and I have another friend that always says, love loves to love. And when you're swimming in love and your experience is love, it's very natural for you to want to share that. And there's a real joy in sharing the essence of who you are with another person. And that's a very different energy than wanting somebody to complete you. It's a very different energy because instead of wanting that other person to complete you, you literally offer your completeness to that other person. Whole different trajectory.
You're absolutely right. Because relationships are not a need. They're a want and a desire, which are two different things. So I don't necessarily need that person to be my companion. But this is what I want. Yeah. And we have to start
I love that distinction.
We have to start thinking like that. Like, this is not a need. The things that I need I already have. But this is the extra things. Relationships is kind of like jewelry. A nice watch. It enhances what you already have. But if you're expecting someone else to give you something that 9 times out of 10 they haven't really given themselves, that's where the problem comes in. Because we're imperfect people, but we are constantly looking for other imperfect people to show perfection, to cover up what we don't want to fix. And that is why I love the title of your next book, because you said living for a living. Talk about that.
Totally. So living for a living, and again, the title of the book comes out of a bit of a pet peeve that I've had. And growing up, people, everybody asks, "What do you want to be? What do you want to do when you grow? When you grow up?" And then you get into adulthood, and people say, "Hey, what is it that you do for a living?" And that question, "What do you do for a living?" It really bothered me because I grew up in a family, and I love my parents, and they did the best they could, but generationally there's just a lot of struggle and poverty that they came from. So the energy and the outlook that my family brought to life was one of struggle. And it's the focus of life was really just about survival. It's just about making enough money to pay the bills. And this was this constant struggle. So to me, when I observed that, even though I appreciated all that they did for myself. I have an older brother. What they did for my brother, I appreciated the struggle. My dad, was an immigrant, came to the United States from a very impoverished part of the world. So, and it was not easy, and so I appreciated that. But what I observed was there has to be more to life than just a perpetual struggle. There's got to be more. It has to be more than just paying the bills. To me, just living for survival and paying the bills, that wasn't living. So when people ask the question, what is it you do for a living, I always felt like we should probably rephrase the question to, hey, what do you do for money? Because that's really what they're asking. What is it that you do for money? But that doesn't mean that you're actually living. And so I wanted to write a book. And, of course, my lifelong quest, my lifelong journey was, is there more to life than just survival? Like, why am I here? Why do I wake up in the morning? Why do I exist? Is it just to pay the bills? Why are we working so hard to live? What's the point of life? And I discovered, and this has been a lifelong journey for me, it was that we're actually here to live, and living. When you live for a living, survival, of course, comes with it, but it's not the main point. That living is the focus, and of course, then the question comes in: is what does it mean to live? Well, that's a broader question, but it certainly means that I experience life in the fullness in which it was intended for me to experience it. That's what it means to live. That means if the day I'm living in, I'm experiencing this day to the fullness of what's possible today. That's living. And so the book is really my journey out of a career that's really just focused on surviving to moving into what my life's work is, which has nothing to do with survival.
Now, Jamal, this is Toni. I want to ask you, you have such an eclectic journey, but I want to go back just a little bit to ask you what was happening around you, or what did you see to make you feel that there was more to life than what you were experiencing with your family?
Yeah, well, what I was witnessing, and I was witnessing a lot of, just in my own parents, I saw an existential, and again, I don't fault them for this. This is nothing that they were doing wrong, but there was a lot going on inside of them that I could see that there was a deep, just a sense of unhappiness and unfulfilledness. There was a desire for opportunity. This is what brought my dad from the other side of the world, over to the United States. There was being here in the U.S. offered possibility. It offered a sense of, security. Well, growing up, my dad never felt secure, even though I was born here in the States. And of course, my experience was, I grew up in the relative ease and comfort of the Western world in comparison to other parts of the world. And I could never understand why my dad didn't feel secure. But I would observe in him this deep sense of insecurity, and it just didn't make any sense to me. So I saw that, and I said, well, there has to be. So the external world, even though my dad was living in a country where there was plenty in relation to the rest of the world, that my dad was doing well. We were never on the street. We always had a place to live. We had food to eat. We had everything we needed. It didn't make sense to me. And what I learned was there has to be more security than the external. So really what we're looking for when it comes to the sense of security, or even a sense of significance, does my life count? Have I amounted to something in life? That deep sense, or am I loved? Am I connected to something bigger than myself? I started to realize that cannot be answered through an external process. Now, no matter how much money you acquire in your bank account. So for my dad, I would ask him, what number do you need in your account before you feel safe? I would ask him that. He couldn't tell me. Sometimes he would throw out a number. Well, whenever he would hit that number, I would say, hey, how do you feel? Do you feel rich? Do you feel wealthy now? And he never did he ever get to a point where he felt wealthy. There was always the need for more. And I just started to realize that we're not going to be happy until we turn toward what I would call an infinite source that goes beyond anything finite. So that's an inner process. So when I started to turn inward, which is what, depending on a person's background, the word spiritual, when I say the word spiritual, all I mean by that is going beyond the physical. Because when we go beyond the physical, that's what's spiritual. That's a spiritual process. So I always, if no matter how much money you have in the bank, like let's take the richest person. I don't know who the richest person is. Maybe it's Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or somebody, and we say, okay, I know that where there's more money than those people have. So no matter what number they have in the bank account, there's always more money outside of their bank account, and that's always the kind of case. So there's more money outside than inside. So if you want to feel infinite, then begin to identify with the infinite, not the finite, and then you become infinite. And I know that sounds really heady and metaphysical, but there's a real reality to it. When you start to go beyond the physical, start to turn inward, you start to tap into infinite dimensions of being, infinite love, infinite wisdom, infinite significance, and this is really where life is birthed from.
But I'm going to ask you,
I love it. Go ahead,
I'm sorry, Lissha. I was going to ask you, but if you're trying to live infinite, are you really living? You know, because if that's what you're striving for, what about your present? What about what you're experiencing in the now? You know, because you're so focused on being infinite or finite. You know, you have this purpose-driven idea or where you want to be that you kind of forget where you are in the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I understand what you're asking. So what I'm hearing you ask is, you know, if you focus on the infinite, like what about real everyday life? Is that kind of what you're asking? What about the day in, day out process of living? Totally.
Right.
Well,
are you living?
It's a great question. Totally, it's a great question. Well, what my experience has been is when we're not focused on the infinite and we're just all, you know, because we're trained to interact with life. You know, our eyes see, so everything's pointed outward. Our eyes are seeing what's out here. You know, we touch the things we touch and hear and smell and taste. These are all external stimulus that is how we interact with life. Well, when that's my sole focus, there's an appearance of lack when we operate in the physical world, because there's an appearance of separation. There's an appearance of, you know, separateness, and this creates an existential angst in us. And so what happens is when we have this anxiety that we're operating in, and this, I go back to my parents, that's all they knew was the external world. They were operating in the external world, and basically when we operate in the external world, we're seeing everything through the lens of the past, because that's how we have, you know, we see through a lens. It's like a fish. If you were to have a conversation with a fish in a fish tank, if you could talk to the fish and say, "How's the water?" You know, they would probably just be able, you know, look back at you and say, "What's water? I've never seen it." Right? Because when you're in something, you don't see what you're in. You don't see the lens through which you're seeing the world through. So when you're living in the external world and you're just operating in reaction to everything that's happening around you, you're processing all of those events through the lens, what I call the psychological lens of everything you've inherited from your past. You're not actually interacting with it the way it actually is. So what's happening is you're in reaction mode. If you're in a relationship, you may hear everything that person is saying and doing through a certain lens that creates drama and struggle. So there's a lot of reaction going on in the relationship. Maybe I feel impoverished in my financial life. So then I'm in reaction mode. I'm trying to hustle and come up with certain jobs that I need to that are going to bring in income because I don't feel like I have enough money. So we're in constant reaction mode. So when we're in reaction mode, my experience has been that's actually not living, because we're reacting to a paradigm that's not even really real. It's so by turning inward and beginning to come back to this place within us. Just so, for example, just in a time of quiet meditation when I can turn off my survival fight or flight mechanism that's operating in my brain, when I can switch that off and learn to breathe deeply and get rooted in my being, I start to feel in that moment absolutely abundant. I start to feel safe. I start to feel loved. And then I take that same energy, which is what I want to get to, that's that infinite sense of love and being connected and all of those things. Then when I approach life with that energy, it's a game changer, because now I'm no longer reacting to life. I'm actually being able to respond to it and engage and create what I want to create from that place. I hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It makes a whole lot of sense, actually. You know, you've had such an amazing journey, and it may seem random to the naked eye, but you had quite a journey to get to this point, to get to the wisdom that you're sharing with our audience tonight. Can you talk about a little bit about being a life coach and how you entered that field? I mean, you started off as if I understand, a correction officer. You know, each part of your journey enhanced that next level, pretty much. Can you just share with us about being a life coach? Because you have so much wisdom that you're expounding upon everybody. Just give us a little bit of background on how you got to this point.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the question. So I started, like you mentioned, I started off, early in life. I got out of high school, and I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And my dad actually had a friendship with somebody who worked for the state of Ohio. It's where I was born and raised, in Columbus, Ohio, and he knew somebody that was able to get a door open for me they said, hey, you should apply to be a corrections officer in a state penitentiary. So my brother actually did that first, and then I had no prospects, didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, so I ended up applying. I got the job, ended up working there for almost 5 years in a state prison, and that was such an instrumental and pivotal job for me, because what I witnessed working with people in their lowest, people, I worked with people that were just, had given up on life. I worked with people that were operating, everything you expect to see in prison. I totally experienced that and saw that. And I like to tell people that I became convinced in the inherent goodness of humanity because I worked in the prison. That's when because I used to actually just think that some people were just bad. They were just inherently, fundamentally flawed or evil. And what I started to realize working in that prison was that people at their core were no different than me. And that we all of us, no matter who we are, no matter what our background is, we all have the same core desires. And what I started to see was when people were, when people were acting out, or when people had committed these crimes, or people were violent, that was a psychological structure, the costume they were wearing, and a lot of that costume was birthed from trauma, from real pain and trauma and abandonment. And I started to see that, and I started to realize that was actually my story as well. I didn't realize that at the time, and I knew that if we could get below that trauma, we could start to see who that person really is. And for most people that were in prison, they had never met themselves. They had no idea who they were. They were just one large ball of reactions. That's their entire life in reaction to trauma, and a lot of that trauma wasn't even theirs. It was generational. So for me, I developed a passion to want to help people free themselves of their own psychological construct. But what I didn't realize is there's a long story that goes into it. I'll spare you all the details. But what I didn't realize was that what I tried to do for other people was really what needed to happen to me, because I had two major pain points in my life. One of those was abandonment. It was a deep sense. Some of this it has to do with my own family dynamic, and a lot of it has to do with generational things that I wasn't aware of. But a lot of it was centered around abandonment. That was a pain point for me. The other pain point was a deep sense of inadequacy, a sense that no matter what I did, it wasn't good enough. It never quite measured up. And again, that was another pain point. So I had spent so much of my life trying to outrun that. If I could just be the right person, people won't abandon me. And yet people abandoned me. In my relationships, it was like a broken record. Same story. No matter how many relationships I'd get in, I would experience abandonment. I would experience relational breakdown. Same thing in any profession. Eventually, it was always not good enough. It was always a day late, a dollar short kind of thing. And eventually that came to a halt. I had this massive breakdown. I ended up went through a divorce, lost most of my relationships, lost all my money, became homeless for a period of time, and was just at rock bottom. And I wanted to die, and I despaired of life. And I wouldn't say I was suicidal, because I didn't even have the energy to do that. I was at a point where if I could have just hit a button to end my life, I would have done it. But one particular day, there was a voice that just popped into my head. And this voice, I like to say, it's the grace of God. It came from beyond me. And this voice said, since you want to die, and you think that would solve all your problems, why don't you do some research on people who have actually died and have come back to talk about it? And I had no idea that there was such. But then I started to realize, there is an entire population of people, especially since modern times, with modern technology, There's a lot of people that have clinically died and have come back with experiences from beyond their body. And I started to do research. I read a book. There was a doctor who had written a book called Life After Life, and there was 100 people who this doctor was able to verify that they had experienced clinical death, and they all had stories to talk about that. And their stories were captivating to me. And one of the things, even though some of the stories were different, there was one common theme. There was many common themes, but one of them that really got my attention was what was communicated to these people who had experienced, they call it near-death experience. What was communicated to them beyond their body was, this isn't your time. You have to go back to your life. You have to go back to your body, because you are here on purpose, and your life is literally was created in purpose. There is something you're here to learn, and there's some things you're here to do, and it's not fulfilled yet, so you need to go back. And they all came back to their body, was resuscitated, and their life was profoundly altered after they came back to life, because they carried with them this deep innate sense that there is no mundane days. Every day you wake up is because you were purposed to be here. And that totally began to lift me out of my depression. And I started to realize, I am not, this isn't my time. I'm here on purpose. And so I started to really lean into that, and to realize that my first purpose is to learn how to live without suffering.
Right.
And that's what opened me up to coaches, and eventually I started to receive help from coaches. And then there was a point in time when somebody looked at me and said, have you ever thought about doing this for other people? And that I had not thought of that. I never would have imagined myself being a life coach, but until that person looked me in the face and said, the world needs what you have experienced, and what you've experienced isn't just for you, it's for others. And that's when I started to contemplate, maybe this is part of my work that I'm here to do. And that was the beginning.
But, you touched on something, Jamal, that Lissha and I talked about at the beginning of the show. In order for you to have a relationship, or to help others, or to do whatever it is that you want to do, you have to know yourself. You have to be able to help yourself in order for you to make room to help others. And it sounds like you have gone through that, because you knew that you had to work on you and before you can even help someone else. And that's so true, and that's so profound that we kind of equate it to learning your craft. In order for you to learn your craft, you have to go through the ups and the downs. And to be successful at it, you have to know your craft. You know what I mean? So for you to be able to be a successful life coach and to be there for those that need you, you had to know what it was that you needed, or to help yourself, like I was saying.
That's so well said. Absolutely. And I didn't know that. It took me a long time to figure that one out, because, I was told, people kept telling me, when I was a corrections officer, I was in a position of authority. So, just wearing the uniform, you thought, okay, I'm in this position of authority. I can speak with authority, into people's lives. It was almost a false pretense, because I hadn't done my own work. And I eventually became a pastor, and I went to Bible college and trained and became a pastor, but nobody trained me how to engineer my own inner experience. I was in pain, and I was trying to solve the problem. A lot of times we try to love others the way we actually needed to be loved, but it has to start with us.
Right.
And I didn't know that. And I was on the run, and eventually, it all came crashing down. And when I realized, none of that matters. What people think of me, what my career is, success, all of that, none of that matters. It's all secondary to my inner being, my inner experience. And when I learned how to take control of the one thing that we actually have control over, which is our inner experience, right? There's a lot of things we don't control in the world, but one of the things we do control is how I experience life. My inner experience of life is really actually under my domain. And I started to learn to take control of that. And that's when I realized, now I have something to offer, because it works for me. But I have to tell people now, if it doesn't work for you, what are you going to try to? You can't give people what doesn't, what you haven't learned to experience yourself. Right. So it's so important to make sure it works for you before you start offering it to the world.
Exactly.
And I totally got that backwards.
Absolutely. And it kind of circles back to what I wanted to ask you at the start of your interview, where you had shared with us that you felt a deep sense of frustration certain things not being talked about, like spirituality, purpose, and work, and things like that. How challenging was it for you to start talking about these things, but for people to start listening? What challenges did you come across in order to get them to listen?
It's a great question. The biggest challenge was when people would always bring up that's great, Jamal, but how does that pay the bills, right? That doesn't actually pay the bills. That doesn't put food on the table. Living for a living is great. I would love to live for a living, but I got to put food on the table. I've heard that a million times. And so it presented an opportunity for me to, number one, say, okay, what has been my experience? Because I can speak from my own experience. So then I began to tell the story. Well, let me tell you how it works for me. And eventually that turned into the book, Living for a Living, where a lot of those tangible examples of how it works for me are in the book. But the other thing is, when you live differently, when you live with a different set of values, it really brings up a psychological, there's a voice in your head. And for me, the voice in my head was, this is what I was raised in. It was, you don't quite measure up. You're not hitting the standards of what your society is setting for you. And when people push back or they don't listen to you, they think you're weird, or they think, man, this guy, I don't know what he's talking about. When those voices come up, it really forces you. And if there's an effect, like that used to really affect me, and it would rattle me. And I remember having a conversation with a mentor who was in my life, and she said, "Why does this bother you? Why does the pushback bother you?" And I said, "Well, because I want people to understand what I'm saying. I think it's." And I had this, it's really for their benefit, and I'm just, I want to help people. And she said, "No, I don't think it's quite that. I don't think that's it at all." I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Listen. The reason it bothers you, this is what I'm perceiving, the reason it bothers you is because it matches it matches your own voice, right? There's a voice in your head that isn't quite sure that what they're saying isn't true. So you're harboring, because there's a voice in your head that says, hey, maybe you are crazy. Maybe you aren't doing this right. Maybe you're deluding yourself here." She said, until you realize that what these voices are saying, until you understand that that's not true, it's always going to affect you. So this is an opportunity for you to look inside and find out where are those lies in you still. And it allowed me to do inner work and to say, oh my gosh, okay, the reason I'm so affected by what another person is saying is because they're playing on an insecurity that I already have in me. So let's look at that insecurity. Let's get close to it. Where did it come from? And let's learn to, and again, that's part of the inner work. It's learning to heal those parts. And when I could begin to really heal that part, really know who I am, know what the truth that I'm here to operate in is, then it didn't matter. It's just everyone is speaking out of their own psychological grid, right? And no one's actually seeing things the way it actually is. And so when I can just, and that's what my understanding of consciousness, the word consciousness means the perception of reality beyond a pattern. If I'm seeing something the way it is, not through my lens, not through my own psychological structure, but I'm just observing the way it is. And so then people's opinions and judgments, they lose they're just words. They're just perspective. And that really, and I kind of have a mantra that I live by, and that is, what other people think of me is none of my business. Because I really have no control over that.
That's a good one.
Totally. What is my business is what I have control over. And that is, I always have control over how I perceive life and how I respond to everything. That's in my domain. And that is my business. But what somebody else thinks is really none of my business.
I like that. I might have to use that, Jamal.
So feel free. I did not originate it, but it works for me. Please take it.
No problem. But I want to add, Jamal, if I may, because sometimes, when you start speaking about something that, that's not normally heard, it's hard to hold the attention of those that you're trying to reach because, what is he talking? Like you said, what is he talking about? It doesn't apply to me. It doesn't, affect me in any way. What is it going to do for me? So there are challenges when you're trying to help someone and you see it, but they haven't necessarily gotten to that point. But the tool, the beauty of it is to just keep feeding them, just feed them. And they'll eventually come around to enjoying what you got cooking. I cook, so I try to, and I love sports and I love cooking, so I always try to find an analogy to bring it all together.
Totally, I love that analogy. Cooking. That's a great analogy because if you could cook the best meal, but if somebody's not hungry, they don't care. It's not going to smell.
Exactly.
The aroma isn't going to really be appealing. So I always say it's a timing thing, right? Wait a little bit, they'll be hungry.
Exactly.
Suffering and
there.
struggle have a way. Totally. And, I always say, okay, the suffering, it took me 20 years of really beating my head against the wall to get my hunger to a pitch where I was open, where I was ready to receive. I see this in my coaching work all the time, You'll be surprised. I have people that even approach me that will actually pay me. And as soon as we start to get into we start to touch, it's like a wound, right? It's painful to touch. As soon as we get close, there's a recoil. It's like, no, I'm not going there. It's like, okay, no problem. You're not done struggling. I always say, I've been there. Like, so, and you know what? They'll go, and fortunately, I've been able to. Sometimes the folks I've worked with, the length of time, it has not been that long. So somebody is not willing to go there, and then 6 months later they come back and go, You're right, totally. I'm ready now because I'm done with this. I'm done with the struggle. That's a great place to be. But it's a timing thing for sure.
It is. It really is. It really is. Well, Jamal, we have so enjoyed having you here on Let's Chat. Please don't let this be your last time. But, here on Let's Chat, we love doing a little fun segment as we end our interviews. So I have a fun question for you. Since this is your first time, I'm going to kind of keep it simple, okay? So I have a fun question for you. Your question is, you have the opportunity to be three things, and I want you to give me these three things in the order that you would like them to be. You have the ability to be the smartest person in the world, the best-looking person in the world, and the richest person in the world. In what order would you take those choices, and why?
Wow. Okay, so let me make sure I'm hearing it correctly. I have the opportunity to be the smartest person in the world, the richest person in the world, and what was the third one?
The best-looking person in the world.
Best-looking person in the world. Okay, so yes. Okay, I would probably. I'd probably put number one, the smartest. Number two,
and why
the richest. And then, so the reason smart, and I want to maybe classify what I mean by smart. By smart, I don't mean like somebody who has acquired a lot of facts and information, right? Like an encyclopedia. Not that kind of smart. Smart from the place of perception, wisdom. So I would want to be the smartest person in the world because then I could perceive life the way it is, and I would know how to live life and approach life. Then I would know what to do. Secondly, with the resources, right, with the money, with the wealth, I would know what to do with it. It's because my goal would be to make this world a better place, to serve and help humanity. But I wouldn't know how to do that if I don't have wisdom. So wisdom first, money would be second, and then looks. Honestly. Because there's so much. My mother actually told me something I'll never forget, and it blew me away. She said the older I get, the more I realize that there are no ugly people in the world. And when she first said it, it stunned me. I just thought, wait, what are you talking about? What do you mean there's no ugly people in the world? There's a lot of ugly people in the world. And then, but the older I get, the more I realize she was spot on. Because who we are as people goes so beyond the physical, right? So I'm like, okay, so to be the best looking person in the world is so subjective, right? Depends on who's looking at me and what they value. So, but the essence of who we are is beautiful. So that would be last on my list.
Okay.
Look at this.
All right. That was great. That was fun, right? That was a fun question. Wasn't too hard.
That was fun.
Wasn't too
No,
challenging.
not at all. No, I love it.
Good. Well, Jamal, please make sure you come back and visit Lissha and I. This is your home now. You're able to come back here anytime. Anytime you have anything on your spirit that you want to get out there, just let us know. We'll make it happen. We'll give you the platform to do so. But before you leave us, please give us your social and any events or projects that you have coming up.
I am so sorry. I got
Jamal.
cut off there for a second. Hello.
No problem.
So sorry
I
about
just wanted to. That's okay. If things happen, I just wanted to thank you for joining us and let you know that this is your home and you're able to come back here anytime. If you have something on your heart that you want to get out, just let Lissha and I know. We'll make it happen because we have the platform to do this. But please share with our audience your social and any projects or events that you have coming up so that we can test them out.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed, the conversation with you guys. It's an honor to be on your show, and I will take you up on that. I hope to come back and have another conversation with you guys. Probably the best way for people to get in touch with me is just through my website, which is JamalJivanjee.com. And I have a podcast and obviously my coaching work and my book, Living for a Living. All the information is hosted there on my website, which is JamalJivanjee.com. And all the links to Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, all of that is there on the website as well.
Awesome. Well, once again, Jamal, thank you for joining us here on Let's Chat tonight. You have an amazing evening and continue to prosper in what it is that you're doing because you're doing some awesome work, and we really appreciate you. So come back and visit Lissha and I one day.
I sure will. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.